Welcome to my virtual classroom.
Good day, teachers. Good day, everyone, and welcome to Ma'am Z's virtual classroom. If you haven't watched episode 3 on disability and its models, I suggest that you have to watch it first because it kind of is a prerequisite to this episode, episode 4, Special and Inclusive Education, Historical and Legal Foundations. To begin with, I would like to show you these pictures. I would like you to think of one word that will describe all these. And whatever that word would be, will actually describe the first few eras of the developments or history of disability. To make it easy for us, I would divide the era into 5. And as we do that, we intend to reach the objectives of the day. And so the era that we are going to talk about today, first, is the era of extermination. That is in the ancient period. Second is the era of ridicule. That is in the medieval period. Third one is in the era of asylum. That is in the Renaissance period. Fourth is the era of education. That is on the Industrial Revolution. And finally, we have the modern period, which will be divided in the 20th and 21st century. Throughout history, people with disabilities have been treated differently from those who conform to or those who fit in societal norms. The living conditions of people with disabilities were brutal in this era. Particularly in the ancient times in China, they practiced infanticide. In the ancient Greece and Rome, they valued physical and mental perfection. And that is why physical appearance, beauty, and intelligence are very much important in those times. So if a person is born with a physical deformity, they were either killed or abandoned. Others are kept as jesters or clowns for nobility in the Roman court. The philosopher Aristotle, just like the ancient Greeks, believed that the man was the highly evolved being, while women is just a giant evolutionary step below, along with those with deformities or disabilities. He further recommended that there should be a law to stop the rearing of children with deformities. In his book, Politics, he wrote, and let me read, "As to the exposure and rearing of children, let there be a law that no deformed child shall live." The end of the Roman period marks the beginning of the medieval period or the Dark Ages in Europe. This era is the rise to Christianity, which led to more humane practices toward people with disabilities. Jesus Christ showed compassion to those people with disabilities, which led the church to provide refuge to those who are in need. Orphanages, hospitals, homes, charitable facilities, and others were provided to those with illnesses or mental illnesses, those who are poor, those who are aged, and those with disabilities, specifically those who are blind. Fear and obsession with God during this period led the religion to provide basic services to those who are in need and to reshape the attitudes of people towards people with disabilities. Because of this, infanticide was discontinued and more humane practices towards people with disabilities in sheltered communities and homes were provided. At this time, people with disabilities were not killed, but were exiled and are treated as a subhuman category that were not given human rights. When leprosy ended after the Crusades, the establishments they used were converted to other users and were given to those who are called as deviant, such as those who are widow, the incurable, the madmen, those with mental illnesses, criminal, prostitutes, and others. Meanwhile, John Calvin preached the notion of predestination, stating that God has already chosen those people who will be saved. He later on mentioned that people with disabilities are not among those who will be chosen. Because of this, disability was seen as a sin of the family or of the person with disability. So in the Philippines is also how people see people with disabilities na may kasalanan ginawa ang kanyang family, kaya nagkaroon siya ng ganyang anak. Or in other religion, they believe in the law of karma, that whatever na ginawa ng previous na generations ay magiging kabayaran sa mga current na generation. While others see disability as punishment, others see that it is a blessing from God. Others perceive that disability is holy, that it provides a certain divine purpose for the family. And therefore, in our country, tinatawag itong swerte sa pamilya. A gradual understanding of science leads to having more harmful and more painful way of treating people with disabilities. In the era of asylum, due to the advancements in medicine, people with disabilities are now regarded as an issue that needs medical assistance. This era sees people with disabilities as subjects, clients as objects to be experimented on who are locked down in a certain facility. That's why it is called as an era of asylum. So these pictures present how people with disabilities were given treatments on this particular era. Therefore, these people with disabilities need to be cured. Otherwise, they will be treated as social problems and public burden. In 1601, Queen Elizabeth of England passed several laws that require the state to take care of their poor and disadvantaged, in which people with disabilities are labeled to be a part of this category. In 1657, France had separate services for females and males who are disadvantaged. Luckily, Philip Pinel came, a leading French psychiatrist of his time, who first mentioned that mental instability is actually an illness or a disease and not immorality or a sin. He later on introduced a more gentle way of treating people with disabilities or illnesses in the hospitals instead of using chains and some physical abuse. In 1793, Pinel became famous for removing the chains and restraints from the inmates in different asylums in France. Going back to the timeline, from the ancient times to the medieval period, you will see a red logo there, which explains the model of disability, which is called as the religious model or moral model. In this model, disability is seen as either a sin on the part of persons with disabilities or their families, or an act of God for some divine purposes. The influence of the church is not seen as evident as compared to the medieval period. In the blue bar, you will see the scientific approach becoming more and more prominent, which means that they probably challenge the ideas provided by the church. In the era of education, social reforms and ideas in education provided opportunities for people with disabilities across the different conditions. In this era, Pinel developed 4 mental classifications for mental illnesses and became one of the founding fathers of psychiatry. From one founding father to the next, John Mark Gaspard Itard, a student of Pinel, studied the case of Victor, the wild boy of Aveyron. Victor was found in the forest in his early teens, and this led to the discovery that people with severe mental retardation, which is now called as intellectual disability, can still have certain improvements at some extent. Edward Seguin, a student of John Mark Gaspard Itard, migrated to the US and there developed some strategies that is still used up to this moment. Dorothea Dix became an advocate for people with mental illnesses and other disabilities to have better services. And then Louis Braille invented the Braille alphabet. And then Anne Sullivan became the famous tutor of Helen Keller. And then Maria Montessori came and introduced her prepared environment. Soon, people with disabilities are now regarded as the responsibility of the state, and therefore training schools and larger schools are provided to them. Now, going back to our timeline, the development of the medical model emerged around 18th to 19th century, which defines disability as any one of the series of biological deficiencies located in the body. In this model, disability is no longer seen as a divine intervention, but as a disease that needs to be cured. And therefore, PWDs are now seen as clients, subjects that are to be treated. And with the advancements of science and education, eugenics happened, or the science of improving human race, wherein people with developmental disabilities had this involuntary sterilization to prevent the passing of inferior traits. In the early 20th century, many public officials believe that those with disabilities or deficiencies are seen as a threat to the nation's health, and therefore they believed and pushed for eugenics. And then social Darwinism came as promoted by Herbert Spencer, stating that only the fittest will survive. This further justified the eugenics movement. One positive event that happened in this era is the beginning of special education. Teachers in the public school become aware of the increasing number of learners with disabilities, and so they call for special classes and special teachers to teach them. And then Binet and Simon develop a scale in measuring intelligence. And then in the 1930s, Holocaust came, and the first victims are the people with disabilities. Nazis sterilized 400,000 Germans and exterminated 200,000 persons with disabilities. Services slowly become available to people with physical disabilities, most especially the soldiers in war, soldiers, while those people with intellectual disabilities, na tawag before is mental retardation, were largely abandoned in the institutions. In the Philippines, as seen as in this framework, special education started in the year 1907 with the establishment of the Insular School for the Deaf and Blind. In the 1950s, in the US, parents started to organize, develop causes and programs in behalf of their children with disabilities. This provided greater acceptance of differences and opportunities and ability and willingness to provide services for PWDs. The advocacies of the parents led to increased funding, better community services, and larger institutions. This has also led to the development of policies such as IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, on the promotion of IEP, or Individualized Education Program. Another policy is on EHA, or Education for All Handicapped Children Act, in which they promoted FAPE, or Free Appropriate Public Education for PWDs. In the Philippines, key developments include Batas Mambansa 344, or the Accessibility Law in 1983. Then we have Proclamation declaring the period 1990 to 1999 as a decade of EFA, or Education for All. World Declaration on Education for All in 1990. Magna Carta for Disabled Persons in 1992. Salamanca Statement on the Education of Children with Disabilities in 1994. Four Pillars in 1996. Institutionalization of SPED programs in all schools in 1997. Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act in 1997. The Dakar Framework for Action, Education for All 2000. RA 9155, or the Governance of Basic Education Act 2001, renaming of Bureau of Non-Formal Education of Bureau of Alternative Learning System, DO 51-2004 on the standard curriculum for LM and private modaries, UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the UNCRPD 2006, the Philippine EFA 2015, UN Declaration on the Rights of IPs 2007, For Peace 2008, Inclusive Education, a Strategy for Increasing Participation Rate of Children in year 2009, Mother Tongue MLE 2009, Mainstreaming and Institutionalization of Madrasa Program 2010, IP Education Policy Framework 2011, DepEd Order 103, Series of 2011, and the creation of Indigenous Peoples Education Office, RA 10157 on the Kindergarten Education Act 2012. We have Implementing Guidelines on the Revised School-Based Management on 2012, RA 10533 on 2013 on the Basic Education. Just to continue, 2013, Batas Kasambahay, RA 10361, 2015, Open System High School System Act, RA 10665, 2016, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IE for Children and Youth with Special Needs Act, 2017, Philippine Professionalization Standards for Teachers, DO 42, Series of 2017, then PSGs for BEd, BSED, and BSNED requiring Prof Ed course on Foundations of Special and Inclusive Education in the year 2017. 2019 is the DepEd Order 21 Policy Guidelines on the K-12 Basic Education Curriculum, in which the framework on inclusive education is placed on Annex 5. And 2020 is an act instituting services for learners with disabilities in support of inclusive education. Now, going back to our timeline, in the 1960s and 1970s, the social model of disability was developed as a reaction to the limitations brought about by the medical model of disability. And so, according to the social model, it is society which disables people with impairments, and therefore any meaningful solution must be directed at societal change rather than individual adjustment and rehabilitation. A closely related model is the identity model. However, the fundamental difference of this model is in the emphasis of identity or affirmation model of disability. This model shares the social model's understanding that the experience of disability is socially constructed, but differs to the extent that it claims disability as a positive identity. Another model that bears close affinity to the social model of disability is the human rights model of disability. While the social model helps people to understand the underlying social factors that shape our understanding of disability, the human rights model moves beyond the explanation, offering a theoretical framework for disability policy that emphasizes the human dignity of PWDs. There are other disability models, such as the charity model, the economic model, the limits model, and the cultural model. But for the sake of this discussion, we are going to end the foundations of legal and historical foundations with this timeline. Now, since we've been talking about special and inclusive education countless times in this episode, let me just define those two areas. First, special education, according to UNESCO, is defined as classes or instruction designed for learners with disabilities and gifted and talented learners, or LDGTL. While inclusive education is a process intended to respond to students' diversity by increasing their participation and reducing exclusion within and from education. Other terminologies that we need to define are mainstreaming and integration. Now, according to UNESCO 2017, Mainstreaming is the practice of educating students with learning challenges in regular classes or during specific time periods based on their skills. Kaya meron tinatawag na part-time mainstreaming, merong full-time mainstreaming. Full-time refers to placement of persons with disabilities in the full access along with the peers or their same age peers o yung mga tinatawag na typically developed na peers. Kapag sinabi naman na part-time, there are certain subjects na na-enjoy niya sa SPED, meron din namang subjects na na-enjoy niya sa regular classroom. The integration, according to UNESCO 2017, learners with disabilities, gifted and talented learners are placed in mainstream education. Now, hindi porket nakita natin yung term na mainstreaming or placement or integration of LDGTL sa loob ng regular classroom, matatawag na agad itong inclusion. Because inclusive education, according to Article 24 of CRPD, refers to education environments that adapt the design and physical structures, teaching methods, and curriculum, as well as the culture, policy, and practice of education environments so that they are accessible to all students without discrimination. Placing students with disabilities within mainstream classes without these adaptations does not constitute inclusion. So, how will we know if we are already doing inclusion? Well, UNESCO made mention that you have to check on these three things. One is presence. That means there are diversity inside the classroom. Next is participation. Therefore, those students are not only seated in one corner of the room, but they are participating well in the classroom. And third is achievement. Therefore, these students, regardless of abilities, physical abilities, and other cultural or social contexts, learn and gain knowledge inside the regular classroom. Therefore, in these circles, inclusion can only happen when these PWDs are placed in the regular classroom and they learn side by side with their same age peers. Now, how can we make sure that learners with disabilities have achievement in the regular classroom? Well, we can do accommodation and modification. Accommodation refers to changing how the learners learn the same material and meet the same expectations as their age peers. Therefore, for those blind students, maglalagay tayo na audio materials sa ating mga PowerPoint presentations. And we have to make sure na accessible ang ating mga materials to them, most especially during this time of pandemic. Another one is the concept of modification. If accommodation changes the how, so modification, it changes the what. So we just learn to assess the needs of the child, for example, a gifted student. And then if that person requires higher level of topics in your subject, then we provide learning materials that are advanced compared sa kanyang same age peers. You'll see here in this picture that inclusive education does not need to do therapy rehabilitations just to accept learners in that classroom. Because inclusive education is a flexible system that acknowledge that children are different and all children can learn. Now, different abilities, ethnic group, size, age, background, gender does not matter. So therefore, it is not a one-size-fits-all program. Well, inclusive education could also be seen in this picture. So, see yung pinakaunang box, there are 3 kids, binigyan ng lahat ng blocks, in which yung third person, dahil maliit siya, hindi niya nakikita yung field. Yun nga ba ang kailangan ng batang ito? The answer is no. So when you see inclusive education gives or provides the need na targeted para dun sa individual person na ito. At yun ang nakikita natin sa second box. Kung matangkad ka na, of course, you no longer need a certain block. But if you're smaller, then you have to be provided with more blocks, which is equivalent to providing more services to person who are in need. So I hope that you learned a lot on this episode. And please hit the subscribe button para you'll be notified on the upcoming lessons. Have a nice day, and let's all be a blessing to one another.